And we're good. All right. So you know where I'm going to start. I'm going to ask somebody the magical question. Anybody know what that magical question is going to be?
What did we cover last week?
Yeah. And I asked that question because I need to be reminded sometimes.
1054.
We did cover 1054, continued on that. We also then talked about a particular thing that really is not as familiar to us as Protestants. Does anybody remember what we talked about?
Well, I know we talked about the Concordat of Worms.
Right. And we talked about the
Investiture.
Investiture we're going to pick back up today. We talked about monasticism. So those monks and nuns living in cloisters and all that fun stuff. Sherry gave me my big piece of learning last week, which is the difference between just a sister and a nun. And so I wanted to ask if anybody had any additional questions about that before we shoot off into investiture as a topic. All right, either did something very right or very wrong. So does anybody remember what investiture means? Why do we call it investiture? Hint, answer on screen.
Clothing and insignia of the office as to the church.
Right. So if you were in a position, let's say you were a bishop that was representing an area of the church, you were given certain clothing, certain insignia. You were given the things that were essentially the uniform of that office. And so the investiture controversy, when it arose, was a way of describing who has the right to decide who's going to get the clothes, who's going to get the insignia, which meant that was who's going to get the office. And as we talked about, hopefully you see a trend that's building here, because it's important to grasp and to understand that trend as we move forward. The relationship between church and state is going through a period of, I'll describe it as tension. And that's going to carry forward here that's going to be a predominant theme in Christianity all the way from then until now, to be very candid. But certainly it's going to be a very important thing over this period of time, running from about the 11th century through to about the 16th century. It's going to be a very, very, very dominant thing that's going on. So what was the church's position on who has the right to decide who's going to be invested? They get to choose, right? After all, it is the church. So who opposed that point of view?
State.
And why would they oppose that point of view, Mickey?
Power.
Yeah, it's always about power, isn't it? And about the other thing, which would be what? Money. And often in politics and government, money is power. So we're tied back to the same thing, right?
They go hand in hand.
They do go hand in hand. And so the church was actually, and still is to this day, in many parts of the world, one of the richest institutions that exists. It's the only thing that, until the rise of modern business, modern commerce, corporations as we know them, are a relatively new thing, on the big time scale of history. Outside of the government, up until, I would argue until the 19th century. I mean, I guess you could argue there were some larger institutions in the 18th commercially. But up until the 19th century, the only thing that could rival the state in terms of power and in terms of money was the church. And so they were either on the same page and aligned in the same direction, which made them an incredibly powerful force, or when they opposed each other, there was a danger to that opposition. And so we talked a little bit that what began to arise was a little bit of this complaint over the practice had been that most of the time local officials, maybe the local lord, even up to the king, so not the nation state, as this idea of nations are starting to become more common. had some say in determining who was appointed. We talked a little bit about that last week. Who often went into these high positions of clergy?
The aristocracy.
Aristocracy. Typically, it was the younger sons of aristocratic families. And the reason for that was if you were the older son, what did you get?
Everything.
The land, everything.
And the title. So if your father was the Lord and you were the older son, you inherited the title.
Hey, you want to listen with
lordship.
with me? Sure.
I'm sorry. If you were the second or third son, there still was a place for you. You still had wealth, you still had position, but normally you found that position in the church. One of the best examples I can think of that of somebody that we all know. Everybody knows who Henry VIII was, right?
Yes.
Henry was not the oldest son of Henry VII. He had an older brother. His older brother's name was actually Arthur. And if you know the story, if you don't, Alexis will be happy to tell you. If you know the story, Catherine of Aragon was first married to Arthur, and then only after Arthur died did Henry assume to the throne, and then eventually the whole situation that produced their marriage. We won't go into all that interesting little part of history, except to say that later in the English Reformation, when Henry decides that he wants either an annulment or divorce from Catherine, he has been somewhat trained in theological matters because as the second oldest son of the king, he was thinking about going into a high position in the church. That was where they had targeted him. He could have very easily been a bishop or a cardinal in England before he went in the direction of being king. So that's a good example there. So we talked a little bit. I think this is pretty much as far as we got last week, which was we came down to Pope Gregory VII. Yeah. And he actually issued a papal decree, a papal bull, in the late 11th century, in which he made it very clear what the papacy's position was, the church's position over things that existed between the question of church and state, which was, he clearly said that the Pope was universal. He alone had the power to depose and reinstate bishops. He alone may use the imperial insignia, that princes had to kiss the foot of the Pope alone, which means they owed their allegiance to him, that he had the power to depose emperors, and he could be judged by no one. So from Gregory VII's point of view, what was the role of the Pope compared to everyone else?
He had supreme authority and power.
Correct. Inside the church?
No, everywhere.
Yeah, inside, yes, but also everywhere, right?
Right.
Morning, Bill and Doug, holding down the fort at the homestead there. They're holding down the original.
Yes. Yeah.
So Pope Gregory's view was that he had the power. Obviously, no one could be Catholic. No one could be part of the universal church if they disagreed with the Roman church. That was part of what it meant to be Catholic, universal. And that he had the power to actually absolve subjects from their oath of fealty to wicked rulers. And so that put the Pope's power above the power of secular rulers. We talked about this a little bit last week. We're still in the review mode, but now transitioning into the new stuff. What was the response of a number of secular rulers? To not be happy with that.
Not happy, yeah.
Yeah. And so the situation arose. I don't want to get down into all the nitty gritty of the detail, though it makes for good history. Would probably make for some really good miniseries on TV, actually, too, if they were well written. And there actually been some movies that are along this line where you see some of the clashes between kings and high church officials. I can think of a few, but basically they do eventually come to a settlement, and that's when we talk. Sherry mentioned this Concordat of Worms in 1122. And so the agreement sort of was a compromise. And so Pope Calixtus II and Henry V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, that's not the Henry V of England, that's the Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, came to this, were the primary leaders of the two sides of this. And so the settlement was that the king no longer had the right to invest the popes, the archbishops, and the bishops. In other words, on the investiture question, the question of who was going to hold the office was going to be inside the realm of the church. So investiture was at the discretion of the church. But those bishops and archbishops, everybody short really of a cardinal, owed their fealty to the secular monarch in exchange for military protection. So the Pope gets to decide who the bishop is, but the bishop is below the king in terms of giving him his fealty and his oath outside of matters of the church. So this was the compromise. Does that make sense?
Did bishops have the authority to excommunicate?
Not on their
Or
own.
just the Pope?
They were that required papal authority as a rule of thumb, especially if it were to be a for example, a king or a duke or someone who held a position of political authority in a feudal system. But certainly they had the power to recommend that, to threaten that, and to do the other things that were the political element of threatening that threat. We talked about last week. That was the ultimate trump card that the church held, right? Was you're excommunicated, which means you're no longer in fellowship with the church, which means you're no longer in fellowship with society. Deal with that, Your Highness. Was sort of the way to go down.
Let me ask a question, just something I wrote, and I'm trying to remember. So the excommunication would mean that they couldn't do business or get to heaven. And what was the reason that the not being able to get to heaven? I forgot what that issue was.
It meant that they were outside the fellowship of the church. And remember, I think the week you guys were traveling we talked about 3 of the views of salvation, one of those being the idea of, I can't even think what the name of it is now. I'm totally blank on it. But the primary Catholic view of salvation represents the fact that there's a satisfaction. And in the satisfaction theory, the church plays a role in distributing the merits that Christ has brought with his death on the cross. And so to be disconnected from the church would mean that you were disconnected for the conduit for those merits to be delivered.
Okay.
And that's a really important thing, because that's where the rubber is going to meet the road on a lot of what we know of is in the Reformation. It's not going to be the only thing with which the Reformation is around, but there's going to be that question of the church's role in salvation versus the individual's role in salvation is going to come.
Yep.
That was important. So we get down to another Pope, Innocent III, where he sort of defines it a little even more about what the role of the Pope is. And that basically the Lord Jesus Christ has set up one ruler over all things as his universal vicar, and as in all things in heaven and earth and hell bow to the need of Christ, so should all obey Christ's vicar. There will be one flock and one shepherd. Who's the flock?
Church.
Who's the shepherd?
The Pope.
In this particular quote, yes, the shepherd is the Pope. Now, it quickly says that's because of Christ.
Yeah.
But he's not here, and he told me I'm the shepherd. Or he told Peter he's the shepherd, and I'm Peter's, through apostolic succession, I can draw a direct line from me to Peter, therefore it is me. And he considered that popes were lower than God, but higher than man, and claiming again that Peter had been invested with in the passage that we've looked at so many times, and then through apostolic succession it had carried down, but that the role of the leader of the church also had the responsibility for the governance of the world. And so this became the church's position during the period of time from the latter 11th century, really pretty much on forward to the Counter-Reformation for the most part, in some way, shape, form, or fashion. So how did that play out? Well, for example, one of the major events that happens during this period of time, during the late or the high Middle Ages, is the 100 Years' War. Does anybody know how long the 100 Years' War lasted?
Was it about 100 years?
Close to 100 years. I remember one of my good friends in high school got upset because he couldn't remember the exact number of years on a test. He said, well, they should have called it the 117-year war. That's about how long it really lasted. But it was an ongoing struggle between France and England. This was, without getting too much in the historical detail there, although it's an incredible historical period. It's in this period that you have Henry V, you have Joan of Arc, you have all of these historical figures that are well known on both sides of that war. But the one thing to know about wars is, what do they cost?
Money.
Money.
Yeah, a little money.
Lots and lots and lots of money. And so it was during this particular period of time, as the church was issuing the things that were going on, the investiture controversy and the settlement from that there came to be the battle between the Pope and monarchs, primarily over money. And it was because various kings, to support their war efforts, wanted to tax the clergy. And so again, there was another need to sort of figure this out. So they go back and forth, as you can see here. The Pope issued a bull. A bull is when the Pope issues a proclamation, a papal bull. But he said, you can't tax the clergy unless I say you can. So that English King Edward III fires back and said, that's fine. None of the priests or none of the church are going to be allowed inside my royal court. Philip IV said, that's fine. I won't tax them, but I just won't let the church in France send any money back to Rome. So it doesn't end up in my pockets. It doesn't end up in your pockets. And so eventually Boniface was forced to back down because he needed the money. And so they came again to another settlement. This time it was, generally a monarch should not tax the church unless it's an emergency. And guess what most monarchs thought was an emergency? War. Yeah. So there came to be, again, this understanding of, as a rule of thumb, the government couldn't tax the church without permission, but there were exceptions to that were agreed. And so what ended up being issued was another decree. This time it's called the Unum Sanctum Decree, which is another strong declaration of the Pope's supremacy over temporal and secular rulers. And Philip IV of France becomes a really powerful mover and shaker in what happens here. He's also called Philip the Fair, by the way. And most things I read in history sort of suggest that came to him as a fair moniker. He was known as sort of being a fair guy. And so he started a series of responses back to that Boniface's sort of reiteration of Gregory's position before and what Innocent III had said. And so basically, he said, enough of this Pope telling us what to do stuff. He sent an army to Rome to arrest the Pope, to basically remove the Pope or to take the Pope into custody. And that army ended up beating the Pope, who ended up dying a few months later. So as you might guess, this caused a little bit of stir. And so that led to what's commonly referred to as the Babylonian Captivity. So if I normally say Babylonian Captivity in Sunday school, what do you assume we're talking about?
Jewish captivity.
Jewish captivity, yeah.
Correct. The Jews being carried off to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the book of Daniel, all of that good stuff. Well, the term came to be applied to this period of time that we're going to go through now, and I'm really going to skim across the top of the history here because it's tempting for me to want to go really deep because there's some good juicy stuff inside of this, but it's not really important to go as deep as to understand the process that was here. But we have a period of time, because of what Philip did, because of those past actions by the Pope declaring the supremacy of the church over the state, and also primarily because England and France are in the middle of this 100 Years' War. That it's not constant conflict, but for a lot of that period of time they're in conflict. It wells up, it calms down, it goes back and forth. But that's the backdrop for all of this. Is that Boniface's successor, Clement V? Remember Boniface? What happened to Boniface? He was basically beaten and then later died as a result of French troops coming to Rome. When his successor was chosen, who was Clement V, he sort of backed down from Boniface's declaration. Any guess as to why that might have been? Maybe he didn't want to have the same fate as Boniface, I'm thinking. And so what he did was he said it didn't diminish French authority over the country's church. And so what actually happens here is during Clement's position as the Pope leaves Rome and goes to this area called Avignon, which is on the border of, basically it's on the French-Italian border. And there was a palace that was already there that was owned by the papacy. And so basically they moved the headquarters for the church, for the Pope, from Rome to Avignon. Everybody following that so far?
Yes.
I realize a map would have probably been a very helpful thing.
Yeah.
Don,
can I get- oh, go ahead, Sherry.
I'm sorry, Don, I have a question. Who's the Holy Roman Emperor at this point?
At that point, I don't recall who exactly the HRE is. It is not, I'm very clear that it's not Philip, though. But the HRE, the Holy Roman Emperor by this point was almost always someone who was from the area that we think of as being Germany today, the German principalities. That was the area that was sort of the consolidated control that was under the Holy Roman Emperor. So without looking, I feel fairly safe in saying it's probably someone who's of German, what we would later think of as being German descent. And they would have been aligned with France more during the 100 Years' War.
The big question that I would like to ask is, it sounds like the Roman Catholic Church is disintegrating, that they don't have the power. If you can excommunicate somebody and somebody goes to their knees and says, please don't do that, as opposed to, I'm going to cut your head off, Pope. I think that's a huge, huge difference. It sounds like
I think you are seeing the decline of the same type of authority, for example, that, well, we talked about 1054 and why it's an important date, right?
Right.
In 1054, the Pope excommunicates the Patriarch of the Eastern Church,
Correct.
and that happens.
Yeah.
And it's not until, almost 1,000 years later that that's rectified. So
could you say that the church became an institution versus a movement?
I think more than anything else, that's the important thing for us to grasp out of this and how it ultimately affects. It's going to come back to having theological implications. So we won't, eventually we will come back and see that. But I think that is the main point, Mickey, is that it becomes very difficult at times when you're reading through these narratives to distinguish which one of these guys is supposed to be the religious leader.
Right.
And that's going to become even more so during some of the series of popes over the next 150-ish years after this, where some of them are just downright despicable characters. We would even call them horrible kings, let alone calling them horrible popes. Alexander immediately jumps into my head, who had 3 different mistresses simultaneously while he was the Pope, openly flaunting that. And then elevated one of his sons to be over the head of the papal army. So how does that look any different from any king or monarch, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it's not.
And in fact, the papacy had actually come to be something that could be bought or controlled. And there were territories, there were lands. So I think, Mickey, you've hit upon the key thing here, which is that more and more the church, in its conflict with politics, was becoming more and more political. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it became so political that for about 70-ish years, that's why they call it the Babylonian Captivity, the center of the papacy moved from Rome, where it traditionally had been. Remember, who is the Pope? What is the Pope's first title that gives him this authority that he claims?
Vicar of Christ.
Bishop of
Yeah.
Rome, because the claim was that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. And so when suddenly the Bishop of Rome has moved up to a border town essentially on the French border called Avignon, that just right there sort of stretches things a little bit, right?
Yes.
And so I think, Mickey, you hit upon the key point here that we want to pull out of this, was that, first of all, Avignon, the palace there at Avignon, again, I probably should have included some pictures here. That is one fantastic looking place. Versailles, if you want to think about something later that's extravagant, that was French. Versailles had a little bit on Avignon, but not a lot. And so those that were outside of the French church sort of alignment, because the church very much did seem to support the French side of the 100 Years' War much more than the English side. They're the ones that started referring to the papacy as being in captivity and calling it the Babylonian Captivity, because there was a lot of scheming going on politically that was opposed to the spiritual situations. Questions about that? And one other important thing to note is that Clement's papacy was controlled by France because at that time, most of the College of Cardinals, and the College of Cardinals, remember, are the group that selects the Pope. France had risen to a position inside the College of Cardinals where there were more of them than there were of the Italian cardinals. And so this was the other reason that there was the ability for there to be more of a French lean to the papacy than there was what had previously been, and would subsequently come to be again, which was very much the Italian lean. And if that wasn't troubling enough, guess what happens next is we end up with, whoops, we get two popes. Now, currently we're living under a situation with two popes, but that's a little bit different because one of them stepped down and became a Pope Emeritus for health. But in this case, when Pope Gregory the Sixth, Gregory the 11th, died in March of 1378, the people in Rome were a little upset that the papacy had moved from Rome to this. It wasn't in France again, it was just near France. If it had been in France, it probably would have even been more of a controversy. But they were upset about the fact that the papacy had moved to Avignon, and so the conclave to elect the Pope was still happening back in Rome. So even though the residence of the Pope was up in Avignon, they would come back and the Pope was still being elected in Rome. So what happened outside the conclave, where the Pope is being elected, was there basically was a mob that grew up outside. And they elected Urban the Sixth, even though he wasn't a cardinal, he had been a curate, he had been part of the church bureaucracy in Rome. He was elected to be the Pope because of basically to acquiesce to this mob that had arisen during the conclave. That's the word I'm looking for. It's right here on the screen in front of me. So, as you can see, the political aspect that Mickey was mentioning has come into play. Now, Urban was not exactly the best guy to be in that rope. He didn't gather advice. He basically, because he was trying to favor the Italian position, sort of lashed out against most of the French cardinals and what was going on there. And so what ultimately happened was the majority of the French cardinals actually withdrew from where he had set up his court, which was not his court, which is not in Avignon, and they basically said he's not really the Pope. And so we voided his election. He only got elected because there were mobs outside the conclave. It was mob rule, not the cardinals making the decision. And so they said, we're going to elect a rightful Pope, and that's going to be Clement the Seventh, who just happened to be the cousin of the French king. So remember we talked about schisms and the Great Schism and different things that are called schisms. This is what is normally referred to as the Papal Schism, because now there are not just one Pope, but there are two Popes. You literally have a division over who is the Pope. Questions? We can get down to a lot of detail here, but I've chosen to just hit the high points because we could get locked in the detail for those of us that love history for weeks. This is a fun. I encourage you to read on this or to find some good YouTube videos. There's astonishing things that happen during this period of time when there's the competition among the papacy. So basically for the next 30 years, there's a series of two different sets of popes depending on which papacy you hold to. The Roman papacy, Urban the Sixth, Boniface the Ninth, Innocent the Seventh, Gregory the 12th, They were basically the traditional popes, if you will, in Rome. They were supported by the Roman state, the area there, what we think of as Italy, Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, and other allies. And then there were the Avion French popes, Clement VII and Benedict XIII. They were supported by the French and their allies. Remember, this is the backdrop behind all of this is the 100 Years' War. France and England are at war. And so the continent's divided over which side of that conflict you're in support of, and the church is divided, now actually with the leadership of the church divided, over which side of the conflict you're sort of in alignment with. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have been a Catholic during this period of time? The lay Catholic.
Hey, Don, I have another question. At what point in time did the College of Cardinals, come into being, and did all the other bishoprics have
The
their
College of Cardinals had come into play several hundred years before. I'd have to go back and look to try to give you an exact date, so I don't want to try to pull one off my top of my head. But it had been in existence before 1054, before the Great Schism. And the role of the cardinals had increased. The role of the cardinals in the election or selection of the next pope really came into play after 1054. It had started before, but remember what had happened before the split in the church? Who had a great say in saying who the pope was going to be? That was the Roman emperor, which at that time was still the Roman emperor in the eastern part of the empire after fallen in 466. So after 1054, where there's the final break between Rome and Constantinople / Byzantium, that's when you have to have a mechanism that brings the Pope forward that does not require the Roman emperor. But remember, that's why, to some great degree, that this position of Holy Roman Emperor had come into being, right? Was that Charlemagne had been crowned essentially as the successor of the position of emperor in the West.
Don?
Yeah.
Which line of popes does the church now acknowledge, or do they, in their church history, or do they acknowledge both?
They acknowledge a little bit of both. It's interesting because the Catholic Church does not deny this happened. They more or less just point to, yeah, but eventually we came back together.
Okay.
The analogy that I would use for us is like the American Civil War. Yeah, there was that period of time when some states were part of a different country, but they're now part of this country again now.
Okay.
So, we'll just sort of look back on that, think of it that way.
What are the dates here? What's the time period that we're talking about?
This runs from, let me get the right thing back in front of me to make sure I've got that right. I've got a timeline for that.
1378.
Yeah, is the end of it. So it begins, it roughly runs for about 70, from the early part of the 14th century till about 1378.
Oh.
About 70 years.
So the Holy Roman Emperor, who supposedly kind of took over for the Roman Emperor because of the split, really doesn't have any power. That's probably why we don't know who they are until we get into later in history with the...
Right. Now they will be prominent because the other thing that happens a little bit before this, which we're going to go back and pick up, the other big historical piece here are the Crusades. So you'll see the role of the Holy Roman Emperor in the Crusades, because those are not as much church action as they are political action. So they have this problem of there's two popes. So to resolve that, they do eventually realize this has to be resolved. And so after a lot of going back over 30 years, they basically reached the conclusion of they're going to throw both of them out and elect a new one. We're going to come together, and we're going to not have two popes, or not have a controversy over who the real pope is. In fact, you will sometimes see the term anti-pope that's used in conjunction with some of these folks that are here. And so, since neither one of them would bow out to the other, they both thought they were the proper pope. They eventually, through this thing that came to rise called the conciliar movement, they end up having the cardinals from both sides, if you will, the Avignon side and the Rome side, abandon their popes because they couldn't come to a compromise for unity. And so they had a council from all over the church to solve the crisis. And what they ended up doing was putting a lot of power back into the hands of the council, in this case, back into the College of Cardinals. And so you see that the assumption here is that the church as a whole is the body of the faithful. The Pope is only a member of the church. He's equal to all others. And the function of the Pope is to be elected the head of the church, and that should be a position of unification and unity to basically exercise the power of the church. And so what you sort of had here was a little bit of pushback from upper levels of the clergy, but all the way down into the church, of saying, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And so a council is called, and what results from that council is they deposed both of the then setting popes. They elected a new pope, a singular unified pope in the form of Alexander V. And he didn't live for very long. He was succeeded shortly by the medieval version of John the 23rd. And so most of the Western church, the Latin church, supported the new popes. But there were still areas inside of the church who claimed that this had been done incorrectly after the Council of Pisa. And so we eventually move forward again with several sets of councils. As you can see here, they remove claimants, they elect a new pope. Another anti-pope gets elected, he abdicates. This goes back and forth, and again, this goes back and forth over a number of years into the early part of the 15th century. Finally, this all comes to an end when we get Pope Pius II, who issues a bull in 1460. All the councils are sort of referred to as erroneous and abominable. Any of the councils are sort of made void, but eventually you get back around to a singular pope. And so the result of this conciliar movement, when they were trying to fix things, was it really ended up not reforming the Catholic Church. It did communicate the value of the leader of the institution should be for everyone, but it did weaken the power of the church in secular life because, again, France obviously still had a lot of control. England started having more control. And while popes again became powerful in the Renaissance, that primarily was more of a local limited territory that they could control. The Papal States, the Italian Peninsula. And so eventually what happens, for example, is we're going to really get into this. This is all the background for when we get into the Reformation, because the Reformation is going to take a number of different positions and points and have a lot of different personalities involved in the Reformation. Luther, Calvin, but you're going to have political authorities that are in there. So at what point do you think, for example, in England, Henry VIII feels like he has the power to break away from the church over this question of a divorce? Why do you think he feels he has the power to do that? Look at what he was breaking away from, right? Look at what it had degraded into. Any questions about that? It's hard to do this justice in an hour, but I didn't want to spend 3 minutes on it either.
Yeah, but Henry was crazy too.
Well, he was crazy, or he was powerful, or he was both. So Mickey really, Mickey did an excellent job of keeping me focused and keeping it on point. The key thing to grasp out of this is what what began to be more and more the nature of the office of Pope was it became far more of a political institution that matched or maybe even exceeded its role as a religious institution.
I was struck by the coincidence, or perhaps not, of the fact that the Black Death occurred right about the time that this split was going on in the papacy.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about, because I don't really want to go too deep into the Black Death, although it's an incredible thing to study. And first of all, it's not just one event, it's a series of events.
Yeah.
Over a number of time. It altered the church in a very powerful, it altered society in a very powerful way.
Yeah.
Not just because of the, well, we know the feel of what it's like to be under the threat, whether it's believed or perceived or whatever, of, you know, something that is deadly. But the amazing thing to me, for those of you that know that Alexis and I do this podcast thing, I did a series of episodes way back about a year ago on the Black Death. In other words, what if there'd been no Black Death? And so I had a chance to do a lot of research into that. The thing that absolutely blew me away when I was doing that research, and I guess I knew this, but I don't think I knew it to this degree, is that no one is exactly sure what percentage of the population died in Europe as a result of the Black Death. But you get numbers between the low 30% and maybe as high as 70%.
Say that one more time.
You get numbers between the percentage of the population that died as a result of the Black Death, the bubonic plague or the Black Death. Actually, it was a series of plagues. It probably wasn't all just one disease or one illness either. Is that nobody really knows exactly what percentage of the population died, but you see the estimates between the low 30% and some will go as high as maybe up to 70%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Either of those numbers is just staggering, right? But the fact that there's that much difference between even what the number is staggering to me. But I'm glad you pointed that out, Doug, because it's an easy thing to lose. That's also part of the backdrop of what's going on here. In fact, it became the case that during this period of time, people were arguing the reason that this has come is this is a judgment from God because of what's going on in how we're managing his church. There were those who held to that position. The other two big things, and I'm glad you brought that up because this really sets a lot of the background. A lot of this is setting up the background for understanding the Reformation and the context that it arises in, is that when I say feudalism, does everybody understand what a feudal society looks like? How that works? Is feudalism a political system or an economic system?
Well, it's really both.
It's both. That's the key point. Is that in feudalism, who owns the land?
The Lord.
The Lord owns the land. The person working the land is the common term that's used as a serf. Basically, you work the land on behalf of your Lord, who owns the land. He owns the profit. He owns your work product, really. What do you get in exchange?
The right to live there and eat some of what you produce.
Correct. You get the right to live underneath his protection.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
Militarily and socially and with courts. And so you give up your rights to, for example, owning land and working that land for yourself. You give that up because the Lord owns the land in exchange for something. Feudalism is the economic and political structure of Europe during the first part of this time that we're talking about. And the church plays a role in that because the church is closely tied with these feudal lords and the feudal states. And your feudal lord owes his allegiance to a king, and his king, the church would argue, owes his allegiance, his position to divine right and to the Pope. That works right up until you have a problem. And the problem is, if you're the landowner, if you're the Lord, is that this plague sweeps through. And what happens to either 1/3 or 2/3 of your workforce?
They die.
They die. So before the plague, before the Black Death, labor is plentiful. There's plenty of people to work the land. When there's plenty of people to work the land, the economic concepts of supply and demand, even though this is pre-capitalism as we would know it, still apply. When there's lots of labor, what happens to the value of labor?
Goes up with fewer labor.
Actually, it goes down.
Goes down.
Because you don't want to work the land, you don't want to live under my protection. There's 10 people over there that do. And you have very little power if you're of the serf class, the non-landholding class, while there's essentially, it's not really overpopulated. In fact, that's the other amazing thing is the population amounts that we're talking about here compared to modern population amounts are also staggering. But
John, did you say, okay, you said that this was the economic and what system?
Political system.
Of
Europe,
what?
of everywhere.
Of Europe, all of Europe, okay.
Basically everywhere in Europe is under a feudalistic approach. Slight variance from country to country, and it works. Maybe the titles are a little bit different, the size of the territories are a little bit different, but pretty much the political lord and then who he owes allegiance to, which is probably now for most of these areas up to a king, not everywhere, but most places up to a king. They own the land, you work the land, they give you protection, they get the fruits of your labor. When the Black Death comes through and anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the population goes away, the balance between the number of workers that are needed. Remember, this is an agricultural society. This is not a commercial society. Cities are not, I mean, there are cities, but they're not like we think of cities in the modern sense. When that changes and suddenly there's now a scarcity of workers, what difference do you think that suddenly has?
Huge.
It's huge. The shoe's suddenly on the other foot, right?
Right.
You're not going to give me what I want here. You're not going to treat me well. You're not going to give me more of my share of my labor here. There's a lord down the road here who needs workers too. If I'm lucky enough to stay alive, I'll vote with my feet and I'll go there. And so we have, during the period of the Black Death, we have feudalism dies. Feudalism comes to an end slowly. It doesn't happen overnight, but it slowly comes to an end primarily because of the tremendous change in the population that's the direct result of the Black Death. Does that make sense? The church is also impacted by the Black Death because the Black Death is no respecter of aristocracy. Lots of these second, third, fifth sons of aristocracy were just as likely to die as they were from anyone else in terms of during the Black Death. In fact, sometimes the rates of death were higher actually during the aristocracy for various reasons. That's another interesting little twist. But the other thing is the church suddenly has a lot of positions that also can't be filled. And so one of the great changes that happens in the church, and this is a trigger that leads towards the Reformation, is that I mentioned before, who was most likely to move into these positions, these clerical positions inside the church?
Second, third sons.
Aristocracy, those that had power and money, right? Suddenly when there's a shortage of that to go around and you still have all of these positions in the church to be filled, what situation would that create? Well, suddenly you now have to expand what you're willing to do to fill those clerical positions. And so there was a rise of a number of people who before the Black Death would have never have been able to have risen from essentially quote unquote common birth, non-noble birth, into a position like bishop or cardinal, that are not only doing that, but they're doing that regularly. And because bishops and cardinals are dying on a regular basis, the deaths inside of some of the clergy, death rates inside of the clergy in many cases exceeded the death rates inside of the population, because they were the ones who were caring for the population and were moving during this period of time and being more exposed to it. And so it changes the economics of society because of a change in the balance between the supply and demand for labor. Feudalism eventually dies as a result of the Black Plague, but the church also becomes, to borrow a modern term, more democratic in the sense that positions of authority inside the church now tend to come more from folks who were not born into the aristocracy. Does that make sense?
Can you hear it okay?
So if you never have the plague, if you never have the Black Death, feudalism probably hangs on for another couple of centuries before some pressure comes along to change it. You also probably don't have quite the springboard to the Reformation happening quite as early, because someone like a Luther or someone like a Calvin would not have been in the positions that they were in a couple of hundred years before the Black Death. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it actually changes society and it changes the church in a huge way. So thanks for mentioning that, Doug. Last thing I want to cover today, so we can get past all of this nasty history stuff and so we can get back to theology in a heavy way next week, is the, although I could stay on the history stuff forever, but I like the theology part too, are the Crusades. When I say crusade, what pops into your head?
Efforts to reclaim the Holy Land.
Correct. So when we say Holy Land, what do we talk? We all know what we're talking about there. We're talking about what?
Israel.
The territory. This was a term I really didn't know until a couple of years ago. That way, the Levant, which is the area there of Israel, Palestine, what we think of, what we call the Holy Land today. And who had grown to be in control of the Holy Land after the mid 8th century?
Muslims.
Islam had swept through there. Remember, early on we were looking at that quick growth of Islam. Within the first 30 years, they've taken control of Jerusalem and on up to Antioch. And so then, of course, the swing across Africa and even into Europe. We talked about that before, particularly on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. So what we find is that the territories that were important to Judaism and, of course, the territories that were important to Christianity in terms of their history were now under foreign control. And so we go through this period of time for the Crusades, and the Crusades were intended to do what? Somebody said it, to win back the Holy Land, right? To make it possible for people to go on pilgrimage there, to actually reclaim the homeland of Christ for Christianity. So what we have is a series of, depending on how you want to count them, you may count as many as 9 Crusades. So we're not going to go through those in incredible detail, but understand the Crusades were not one single event over a couple of year period of time. This goes on for an extended period of time. As you can see from the dates that I have on the screen here, it goes on for the better part of almost 200 years that we actually get the concept of the Crusades. So let's look a little bit about the history of the Crusades. So the important thing to remember about the Crusades is that the perception of Christianity is that the Holy Land has fallen under foreign, non-Christian control. And at various points, it was still very possible and very easy for Christians to go there and not have any conflict with the Arabs that were controlling the territory. But at other times, depending on who the Arab leadership was, there were issues that were there. And so what we see is that after the fall, after the split, the Great Schism between the East and the West, but actually this had been building up before that particular period of time, but certainly right after the split between the two empires, is that we end up having this situation where there's now a great concern to be able to go and take that back. So when we talk about the motivations for the Crusades, one motivation is probably a quote unquote pure motivation, which is what I just described there. Let's go take back the Holy Land. But as you might guess, because of what we've been talking about through the first part of the class today, what might be some other motivations that might be going around at the same time?
Riches and power.
Dare we say political and economic? Because they were. And so the Crusades are this interesting mix of religious fervor to some degree, but also political machinations that are going on inside of that. And again, if you're a student of history or just like it, there's some really rich, good stuff inside the Crusades. You can wander around, as I have for most of the last month, and all kinds of documentaries and readings. And I knew some of this stuff. I'd forgotten some of this stuff and got reminded of it. But it's some good, juicy stuff. Like I said, you can make mini series about this all day long. But the Crusades are important because they're the other thing that's going on in the backdrop of what we've just been talking about a little bit before. And so it starts initially when Alexius I, who is the Byzantine emperor, this is in the late part of the 11th century, after there's been the split, actually asks for help because the concern is, let me go back a screen, the concern is that more and more Byzantium, Constantinople, which is right here, is coming under threat from the expansion and the forces of Islam. And so one of the concerns is not just that the Holy Land has fallen to Islamic forces, but that they are continuing to sweep, as they had swept up through Europe, they're continuing to sweep from the eastern direction, and that puts Constantinople under potential of being lost. And in fact, the number of times that Constantinople is put under siege is incredible in our history. The fact that it doesn't fall for another 400-ish years is sort of is a testament to just what a fantastic defensive position Constantinople represented from a military standpoint. And so the First Crusade primarily gets launched as the Western Church, the Western Pope at that time, Urban II, responding to a plea from the Byzantine emperor. And this is, again, not long after the schism that's happened in the church. And so we have the backdrop of the investiture controversy. And so there's conflict between secular and religious powers. And people became really personally engaged in that investiture thing. The people were worried about what was going on there. Several historians that I read almost argued that in some ways the Crusades might be thought of as a diversion, a way to divert the fervor of the people away from this conflict that was going on between the church and the leadership. And as a result, there were a lot of Christians who wanted to do something. And so that something ended up being answering the papal call to go on crusade. And so we'd already talked about there had been the change in papal politics. You'd already had the monastic movement, the Great Schism, which had split the church. And so then what comes along, had already been European expansionism. I don't want to necessarily spend too much time going back into all of this political background, but the political authorities in Europe are growing in power. William's conquered England. The Muslims are being pushed down the Spanish peninsula. So you have more a rise of what eventually will become Spain. You have the things that are going on the Italian peninsula where the French Normans have come into there. You have the expansion of Muslim interests, and they're very close to actually taking control of Constantinople when this plea comes from Alexius. And so in 1095, Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. And the objectives are what you see here on the screen. It's to drive the Turks out of Anatolia, out of what we call Turkey today, where they're putting pressure on Constantinople. Another possible thing is, hey, you know, those people we just excommunicated and split from, they'll owe us something if we go and help them. It could help maybe bring this schism back under terms. And oh, by the way, yeah, the idea of recapturing the Holy Land. So understand that while that fourth point there is a motivation, there were multiple motivations for why to have a crusade. Any questions about that? Okay. So He calls for the crusade in 1095, and you begin to actually have a number of preachers that go out that basically start, propagandizing, I guess is a fair word, but promoting this idea of a crusade. And I mentioned before, what's one of the things that you get if you get to go on crusade?
An indulgence.
Papal indulgence. So what is a papal indulgence?
Get out of purgatory free card.
That's a nice way of describing it in simple terms. Normally, what did you need to avoid purgatory in the concept of Catholic salvation at your death? By the way, still true today.
Last rites.
Last rites.
Yeah.
Make sure you don't have any unconfessed, unaddressed sin at the time of your death. Otherwise, you need to go to purgatory to purge out that sin before your transition to heaven. So a general indulgence allowed you to not have to worry about that because you were doing something on behalf of the church. So the motivation was anyone that did a papal indulgence.
They get to play God. Yeah.
So the first crusade in 1097, 1098, it actually, after a lot of effort, was successful in accomplishing the major objective of capturing the Holy Land. Eventually they do, after a lot of things happen, this is a long story, again, we could have spent a whole hour on this, they do eventually seize Jerusalem and take it back from Arab control. They eventually push back the Turks who had been threatening Constantinople, Byzantium, and they accomplish much of the military objectives, if you will, of the crusade. In the process, though, they do not reunite well with the Byzantine Empire, with the Eastern Empire, because the way that it ends up playing out, just because of the events of the crusade, is there are multiple instances where those who had come as the Crusaders felt like they got over here, and instead of getting support from the emperor in Constantinople, his forces, in fact, at one point actually withdrew at a major critical point in the battle, and they sort of felt like they were left hanging out to dry. And so when they eventually push through and are successful in taking the Holy Land back after some effort, there's this big event that happens at the Siege of Antioch where they finally get control of Antioch, and all kinds of things happen there. The general attitude of most of the Crusaders is, we came over to help you folks and you didn't even help yourselves. So we're not exactly happy about that. But the First Crusade could be considered a success if you look at the accomplishment about the Holy Land itself. And eventually they do create what are known as the Crusader states, which are these areas or territory of control, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. These territories are created in the Holy Land, and guess who gets to be over these territories? European political people, those who had come. So some of the lesser sons of some of the European nation states, they now have their kingdoms and principalities over in the Holy Land.
So the bishops at this point in these areas are no more.
They had no longer been what they were back during the early councils that we saw in the 4th century. That's correct. Or they were captive. In fact, in many cases, they were allowed to, Christians were allowed, for example, to worship in Antioch, which had been one of the key seats. They were just under Arab control. The Second Crusade, not quite as successful. It had a lot of failures. It discredited the Crusaders as a military threat. Eventually, their holding of these territories in the Holy Land is only short-lived. It's only a period of time between squabbling and infighting among the Crusaders who had stayed, and the Arab desire to push back and to take back the territories. And they're much closer to those territories. It's easier for them to do that. Just the military concept of supply lines and what you do there. And so the Second Crusade sort of is far less successful and actually ends up being much of a failure. Then you get down to the Third Crusade. This is the one that's sort of well known from literature. This has Richard the Lionhearted of England and Philip II of France and Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor. All the stuff that goes on in Robin Hood is because Richard is away on crusade, if you remember that part of the story. And so the Third Crusade ends up with Saladin as an unbelievable historic figure to study on the Muslim side. He's the one that's in control of Jerusalem. Eventually, between Richard and Saladin, there grows to be a respect for each other, and they eventually settle the Third Crusade sort of through a treaty about what will happen that will give Christians access to Jerusalem, even though it's still under Muslim control. And there's some interesting, just great little stories and anecdotes that go along with the Third Crusade. And so it sort of restores back a little bit of the success status of the First Crusade, although it's not military success, it actually has to be negotiated. So by the time of 1191, now remember how far this is removed. The First Crusade was called almost 100 years before, by the time we get to this Third Crusade. They pretty much have sort of achieved the goal of getting access to the Holy Land and that particular thing that's there. There's been no reuniting of the Eastern and Western empires and the Eastern and Western churches. In fact, after the First Crusade and the Second Crusade, there's even more of a disdain between the Western political powers and the Eastern political powers from what's happened there. So much so that by the time we get to the Fourth Crusade, this really plays itself out in a really nasty way. The Fourth Crusade in concept is going to go back and further take, because the treaty, the solution, the truce that have been agreed by Richard and Saladin falls apart after those two personalities are not involved. This Fourth Crusade is financed primarily by Venetian. It's more of a commercial interest than anything else. If I can go back and pull the map here, it explains it better than anything else. So let me pull that up. You'll see the Fourth Crusade is this purple line here. It never makes it farther than the staging point near Constantinople. And the reason is, by the time the Fourth Crusade makes its way over there, they end up not going to the Holy Land. Who do you think they end up attacking?
Constantinople.
Yep. This ends up being a crusade against the Eastern Empire. And so what ultimately happens is in 1204, we're actually going to go far enough. What happens in 1204 is they actually don't go to the Holy Land, recapture Jerusalem. They end up sacking Constantinople. And so this becomes the last hurrah of any hopes that the actions of the crusade or reuniting the two halves of the empire, healing up the Great Schism from 1054 is going to happen. This sort of puts the nail in that coffin because the attitude of the West is that we went over to help these folks in the East and they couldn't even help themselves. The attitude of those in the East is, you guys just came over and sacked us. You didn't do what you came to do. And so that forever sort of puts the schism into the final position where there's not going to be reconciliation between the East and the West. In fact, by the time you get to 1453, which is when Constantinople, Byzantium falls, they don't even ask the West for help because of what's happened as a result of the Crusades hundreds of years before. Questions about that?
So all the Crusades were Roman initiated?
Not necessarily. In fact, when we get into, let me pull up, I have a chart, which is actually the better place to go than these slides. So here's a chart of the 9 Crusades. The first one was called for by the Pope. The second one was called for by the Pope, was led by the Holy Roman Emperor. The third, also papal inspired. This is the one where Richard and Philip and Frederick do that. The fourth one was not, all of them were endorsed by the church to some degree, although you have some weird things that happen here. I didn't even talk about them. There's something called the Children's Crusade in 1212, where it wasn't the Pope saying or a leader saying, basically kids just got together and said, we're going to the Holy Land. And they head off, and as you well imagine, that did not end well with a bunch of children with no supplies, no leadership. A lot of them get sold into slavery or die on the way. By the time of the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th Crusades, these tend to be endorsed by the church, but primarily called by various political leaders. So it degenerates from being what Urban II called for in the First Crusade, which also had a political air to it, don't forget that, into something that eventually just became various political leaders wanting to go and try to take territory or gain wealth or possessions. And a common theme you will see here are the Holy Roman Emperors and their role in this, which is how the church sort of played into it.
Was Richard King of England by the time he led the Third Crusade, or was he still a prince?
Yes, and then he had to come back very quickly to England because of the uprising that was happening while he was gone.
That's right. That was Robin Hood and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and then eventually you get into that eventually leads to John becoming king in England, and Magna Carta. You know, the abuses there, the Magna Carta there, all of those types of things. In fact, you can indirectly say that a lot of the turmoil in England that led to a lot of our rights we derive from the Magna Carta, you could say indirectly came as a result of the Crusades.
Yeah.
I think you would have had a very different England, at least for that period of time, if Richard was not off on crusade, but was instead at home in his England. And in fact, he was initially not, this is an important thing, and we could spend a lot of time going through the history of the Crusades, and I'll put some links on the class site to some really good online YouTube videos that are historically good, but are also well done, particularly talking about these events, is that Richard was not originally supposed to be there. Basically what happened to that Third Crusade army is they got over into an area in Greece and the leadership sort of fizzled, and they had to call Richard and Philip to come over and assume leadership of the army that was already over there that had lost its leadership. So they didn't lead off originally planning to be the leaders of that particular crusade. They were sort of pressed into it in an emergency after the army got over there and things sort of deteriorated. The Fourth Crusade is probably, though, in terms of the lasting impact on history, is probably the most critical because, again, that was the one that put the nail in the coffin on any restoration between the two halves of the church. One other important backdrop to this is another important thing did also come out of the Crusades. We talked about the Black Death and its influence. Modern banking, as we know it, had its early roots in the Crusade. Eventually, what will rise to be the power of the Knights Templar and some of the other things were the result of the fact that you needed to have provisions for transferring your funding as you were moving from Europe over to England to buy supplies and to take care of things. And so mechanisms for tracking essentially your ability to have access to funds if you were in Antioch, even though your funds had been deposited back in France, the concepts of modern banking, what eventually will become modern banking, and the transfer of wealth flow out of the needs to back up what's going on in the Crusades.
Concept of a check.
Yes.
Right. Check.
And the Templars, for example, became incredibly powerful in this respect. They had secret coding ways to encode the document and double ledger systems that allowed them to know what you had deposited here and what you were entitled to over there. They set up some pretty sophisticated, what would eventually become pretty sophisticated modern ways of dealing with commerce that were a result of the needs of the Crusade. So that established something. And then eventually what, of course, you do have, we recognize or notice Friday the 13th because of the way that we do. The Templars, because of all of that, had grown to such economic power in France that eventually the French monarchy said enough of these guys. And it was on that particular Friday the 13th that all the Templars throughout all of France were seized and put under arrest with different stories depending on which side you're on there about why that was chosen to do so, but definitely had something to do with the economic power.
Don, since the Fourth Crusade was so important, who is Fulk of Nouel?
He was the original person that launched the crusade out of France, but he was heavily influenced by some of the Italian interests there. I'll have to confess, I know the name and I remember reading it in some of the background material, but I don't know a lot of his biography. But the motivation of that Fourth Crusade was not religious. The motivation of that Fourth Crusade, primarily backed by Venetian merchants, was all about let's get over there and get access to some of the treasures that are there. And Kathy and I and my mother-in-law last weekend watched an interesting documentary series on Amazon Prime, which was basically tracking the Silk Road from Venice all the way over to China, and you get a real understanding about just how rich having access to the merchant routes between the East and the West were. And so a lot of the Crusades turned into trying to take advantage and control of that. Questions about the Crusades? Again, we could have spent 3 weeks on the Crusades. I just didn't want to get down into all of the nitty gritty of that, but there's some good nitty gritty there for those of you that like history. Saladin, for example, on the Muslim side, is one of the most interesting characters in history you could ever study. A brilliant leader, brilliant military commander. It's just chock full of personalities. Richard is an interesting character. Even Frederick I there is an interesting character. So sort of as we conclude down here, I know we need to get to that because of the status of those who want to get from where you are maybe to the church. The reason for going through these particular 3 primary areas of history that we looked at there, so the investiture controversy, the Crusades, and the Papal Schism, is all of this, as I mentioned there, sets up for the backdrop for the Reformation. This is how you get to where somebody like Luther and Calvin are at a position where they are going to challenge what the church has become. And a lot of that is flowing from this particular incident. I either confused everybody out the wazoo or I did a really good job, and I don't know which. Everybody's quiet.
Did a good job, but lots to take in.
It's a lot to take in.
Yes.
I was going to say, we got to process it.
But if the key thing I want you to understand when we pick things back up, because we're really going to pick things back up with the Reformation. That's where we're going to be next week. Is I really want to make sure everybody has that good understanding of where the church has been for about 300 years prior to that. It's become a political institution. There's a lot of controversy inside the church. It's taking on temporal power, and it is engaged in international things and not just in religious things. That's the setting that we come to by the Reformation. Oh, by the way, somewhere in the order of half of the population of Europe has died over about a 50 or 60 year period of time because of the Black Death. All right.
One more question about the papacy. This will be, Mickey will like this one too. When did the popes begin the practice or the law, in theory anyway, of being celibate?
It is, I'm trying to put the exact timeline for this. It is in the period of around the 9th to 10th to the 11th century that becomes more the norm.
What was the question?
The celibacy of the Pope, or actually,
okay.
And really there, the celibacy of the Pope is the question of the celibacy of just priests in general. That really kicks in around the It really kicks in around the 11th to 12th century being the norm. You have a lot of popes up until that time that had been married before, or were married, or had that were legitimately properly married before assuming the papacy. That had been that. For example, was Peter married?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
We know that from Scripture, right? So
Yes.
it's only a later invention, and we'll talk a little bit about this. I'll make that a point of it covering in the first part of next week about when that happens and how that happens. So it wasn't always the case that the Bishop of Rome was celibate and not married. So why did it become the position, right?
Right.
And then that's an important part of the Reformation because Luther is originally a monk, but once the Reformation kicks in and Lutheranism comes to be, Luther gets married. In fact, Luther marries a nun. So we'll definitely talk about that because again, that ties back into what's the requirements even of the clergy that had come into what had come to be during this period of time. Good question though. I'll make sure that's the first thing we lead off with next week before we start dipping into the real elements of the Reformation. And really, sort of the whole thrust of this study, of course, has been the broad history of the church. But the most critical thing to understand how we are where we are today is the Reformation. Our roots go all the way back, obviously, to the Gospel and to the New Testament. But our roots, in terms of how we organize and function as a congregational body, are primarily the results of being on this side of the Reformation. And our theology definitely draws from being on this side of the Reformation. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.